I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who tells this story, not out loud, not to anyone, but silence has a way of rotting you from the inside, and tonight I choose to open the door that's been creaking behind my ribs for too long. It began innocently, as most betrayals do. A work dinner, polite laughter, wine-filled glasses reflecting candlelight, and eyes that lingered a little too long on mine, eyes that didn't belong to my husband. I had dressed with extra care that night, hoping maybe my husband would notice. He didn't. He kissed my cheek absently, barely looking up from his phone as he told me to enjoy the meeting. I wanted to shrug it off. Marriage is routine, right? But that tiny ache of being unseen didn't disappear. It settled in my chest like cold water, the kind of ache that makes you crave warmth from any source. The meeting ended late. Rain fell like a quiet conspiracy outside. And he, my husband's boss, offered to drive me home. I should have said no, I knew that, but the words never came out. Instead, I nodded, stepping into the warmth of his car, the door shutting behind me like a secret whispered to the dark. The drive was filled with conversation, light and easy, yet heavy with something unsaid. He asked about me, really asked, about my dreams, my fears, the things I missed before marriage swallowed me whole. And in the way he listened, I felt seen, felt wanted in a way that had gone missing at home. I told myself this was just kindness, that I was just lonely, that there was no harm in talking, but the air between us pulsed with unspoken possibilities, dangerous ones. When we reached my street, he didn't turn off the engine right away. We sat there, breathless in silence. I felt his eyes on me like a hand. I didn't move, neither did he. There was no kiss, no touch. But something shifted in that stillness, something irreversible, a line crossed not by bodies but by hearts, a moment that married my guilt to his gaze forever. Since that night, I've played it over in my head, like a song stuck on a broken loop. I never slept with him, but something in me did, something I can't take back, and that's the part no one tells you about emotional betrayal. It leaves a bruise just as dark as the physical kind, maybe deeper. At home, I pretend, I cook dinner, I smile, I lay next to a man who doesn't ask why I'm suddenly quiet, why my eyes flicker when the phone rings. He doesn't notice the silence between us growing wider, filling the room like smoke. I want to scream at him, ask him why he stopped seeing me, but I know I carry guilt too. I allowed a stranger to shine light on wounds I never dared to show my husband. I opened the door, I stepped inside. I sat in that car. That night didn't lead to an affair, but it left a crack, and sometimes cracks are more dangerous than breaks. They look whole on the surface, but inside everything is splitting. I haven't spoken to him since, not directly. He stays professional, I stay composed. But sometimes in a room full of people, I catch his glance across the table and the silence between us screams. I don't know if I cheated. I don't know if there's a word for what I did. All I know is that I came home feeling like a different woman, a woman who now understands how loneliness can lead you to places you never thought you'd go, a woman who carries both the blame and the ache, a woman who smiles at dinner while her heart quietly folds in on itself. I tell this story not to be judged and not to justify, but because there are many of us out there, caught in the gray spaces of loyalty. We don't always fall into beds. Sometimes we just fall into moments. And sometimes moments are enough to change everything. Because when the man who shouldn't matter makes you feel like you do, you start to question the life you've built. You start to wonder if love without presence is love at all. You realize how silence from the one you vowed to grow old with can become louder than any words uttered in temptation. And the worst part, it's not the betrayal that haunts you. It's the memory of finally being seen, just once, by someone who wasn't supposed to look. Some nights I lie awake and trace back the unraveling, wondering if it started with a missed date, an unanswered question, or the first time I stopped telling him how my day really was. It's strange how emotional distance never announces itself with thunder. It just drips, slowly, until you're soaked and don't remember when you got wet. And in that wet, cold silence, someone else offered warmth. He didn't come with grand gestures or promises, just attention, just interest, just eyes that stayed on me when I spoke. And in that fragile, dangerous space, I felt alive again. Not as a wife, not as a caregiver, not as a fixture in someone else's routine, but as me. That was all it took. That was the crack in the dam. I keep telling myself I didn't do anything wrong, but that's not the full truth, is it? Because even if the act was never physical, the intimacy was real. The betrayal lived in the heartbeat, in the choices I made not to tell, in the way I smiled at his texts and deleted them before anyone saw, in the part of me that leaned into the attention like a wilted flower chasing sun. And now I live in the after, a quiet, aching after, where nothing exploded, but everything is changed, where I wonder if emotional loyalty is just as fragile as physical vows, where I question whether love is supposed to feel this lonely. Or if I just forgot how to ask for more. I still see him sometimes, in meetings, in corridors, in half-lit conference rooms. We nod, we speak, but there's a shadow between us now, a shared knowledge, a boundary neither of us crossed, but both of us wanted to. A memory so vivid it pulses under my skin. I haven't told my husband. Maybe I never will. Not because I want to hide, but because I don't even know how to explain what this was. A storm that never broke, a fire that never burned, but scorched all the same. And that drive home, it ended at my doorstep, but the journey it started inside me, that's still going. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. A shift in the air between us, like a door slowly closing somewhere inside our home that neither of us noticed until it was already shut. We were still doing the things couples do, sharing meals, making plans, paying bills, existing side by side. But something essential had faded, like a light bulb slowly dimming rather than bursting out. I couldn't even pinpoint the moment it began. That's the danger of emotional distance. It's insidious. It doesn't crash into your life with sirens. It seeps in like fog, blurring everything you once saw so clearly. At first, I thought it was just stress. He had been working long hours, often coming home tired, distracted, wrapped up in things I didn't understand anymore. His phone became an extension of his hand, glowing with meetings, messages, obligations. I would try to talk to him, to share something about my day, but he'd nod distractedly or murmur a half-interested response. I would pause, waiting for his eyes to meet mine, craving that flicker of connection, but it rarely came. I started speaking less, because what was the point of being heard if you weren't really being listened to? The silence between us wasn't hostile. It was polite, civilized, even comfortable in a way, but it was hollow. There were no arguments, no outbursts of anger, just the kind of stillness that comes when two people forget how to truly engage. It was like living with a ghost who had all his routines intact, but none of the spirit that once made our relationship feel alive. And I know I wasn't blameless. I withdrew too. I stopped trying as hard to bridge the gap because the rejection stung too much. So I adapted. I smiled. I asked how his day was, knowing the answer wouldn't really be for me. I began to feel invisible in my own life, like wallpaper. There, consistent, unnoticed. When we were first together, he would look at me like I was a mystery he couldn't wait to unfold. Now he barely looked at all. I could wear something new, change my hair, linger in a dress a moment longer, hoping to catch his attention, and still nothing. It made me feel foolish, even desperate. I hated that feeling. I hated feeling like I was begging for scraps of affection in a house where I should have been safe. What hurt more than anything was that he didn't seem to notice my hurt. He didn't ask. He didn't probe when I went quiet. He never asked if I was okay or if something had changed. He assumed everything was fine because on the surface it was. We were functioning, but underneath I was aching. I was missing the man I used to laugh with late into the night, the one who used to trace his fingers across my back in bed, the one who used to make me feel like I was seen, not just acknowledged, but truly seen. This kind of emotional isolation is hard to explain to others. There's no drama to it, no betrayal you can point to. It's just the slow erosion of intimacy, the slow crumbling of shared emotional ground. I didn't realize how deeply lonely I had become until someone else noticed. And isn't that always how it goes? You don't realize how thirsty you are until someone offers you a drink. That loneliness became a space, a silent vacuum waiting to be filled. And the worst part was that I couldn't talk to him about it. I tried once or twice gently. I asked if he was okay, if we were okay. He smiled, confused, kissed my forehead, and said, of course, but his words didn't reach my heart. They bounced off the wall I'd already started building inside myself, the wall that said don't expect too much anymore, it hurts less that way. So I began holding my emotions closer to my chest. I shared less. I looked elsewhere for the kinds of conversations and energy that once lived in our bedroom and over our dinner table. Not in a conscious way, but through tiny acts of turning outward instead of inward. I was vulnerable in a way I hadn't realized. Not because I wanted someone new, but because I desperately needed someone, anyone, to remind me that I was still capable of being felt, noticed, wanted. And that is what emotional vulnerability really looks like. It's not always about longing for passion or escape. Sometimes it's simply about not wanting to feel invisible anymore. It's a quiet, aching need for connection, the kind of need that, when left unanswered, opens doors you never meant to walk through. It didn't feel dangerous at first. It felt flattering, innocent even, a compliment here, a longer conversation than necessary, a glance that held just a second too long. I didn't recognize the signs right away because I wasn't looking for them. I wasn't looking for him, but maybe a part of me was quietly craving what he brought into focus, attention. Not the kind that embarrasses you or feels inappropriate, but the kind that makes you remember who you were before you became someone's wife, someone's background character. He was charming, but not in a rehearsed or theatrical way. He had an ease about him, a way of being present that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. And when he spoke to me, he wasn't just waiting for his turn to talk. He actually listened. He noticed things that had gone unnoticed for far too long. My necklace, my perfume, the way I tucked my hair behind my ear when I was nervous. These were small details, meaningless on their own, but together they formed a picture of someone who was paying attention. And when you've been emotionally starving, even the smallest crumbs feel like a feast. What made it more complicated was that he didn't push. There was no obvious seduction, no boundary explicitly crossed. That's what made it so intoxicating, because it all stayed just beneath the surface, wrapped in plausible deniability. He wasn't inappropriate, but his presence was magnetic. He asked questions no one else bothered to ask, and more questions about my dreams, my passions. What I missed about myself before I became a version of me defined only by routine. And I answered, I opened up. I let those conversations happen because they felt good. They made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in a long time. It wasn't about sex. It wasn't even about physical attraction at first. It was about emotional oxygen. The way he laughed at my jokes without checking his watch. The way he remembered small things I'd said in passing and brought them up days later. My husband had once done those things, but life had gotten heavy, and somewhere along the way, the noticing stopped. So when someone else noticed, really noticed, it was like being pulled out of a fog I hadn't realized I'd been living in. I started looking forward to meetings where I knew he'd be present. I hated that I noticed what shirt he was wearing, or that I found myself rehearsing what I would say, how I would sound clever without trying too hard. It felt ridiculous, adolescent even, but the emotional response was real. It wasn't about wanting to act on anything. It was about enjoying the feeling of being seen and appreciated. There was no flirting, not really, but there was a current, unspoken, subtle, charged, and I let it flow because it filled a space inside me that had gone too long unfilled. He began to represent everything I was missing without even trying: confidence, warmth, engagement, and the worst part was how naturally I responded. I didn't need to convince myself to lean in when he spoke. I didn't have to force the smile or feign interest. It was effortless, and that scared me because effortless meant real. Effortless meant vulnerable. It meant I was crossing a line in my mind before I ever crossed one in reality. This emotional connection began to shape my thoughts when I was alone. I would replay our conversations, notice how I felt lighter after speaking to him. I started comparing, without meaning to. The contrast between the way he saw me and the way I'd been ignored at home became too glaring to ignore. I didn't want to be the woman who mentally strayed, but I was already becoming her, not out of lust, but out of hunger. Not for touch, but for tenderness, for someone to say, I see you, I hear you, you matter. Even in public settings where everything remained appropriate, our interactions felt like secrets. Not because we were doing anything wrong, but because there was an awareness we both shared that others couldn't quite see. It was like we were operating on a frequency no one else was tuned into. And every time he smiled at me across a room, it sent a quiet ripple through my chest, one that both thrilled and terrified me. Looking back, I know that connection wasn't harmless, no matter how carefully I tried to contain it. Emotional affairs don't need skin to feel intimate. They just need recognition. Something honest and raw passing between two people who were never supposed to reach for each other in the first place. And once you've felt that kind of electricity, it changes your sense of what you deserve, what you've been missing, and how long you've been silently waiting for someone to notice. The night it happened was quiet. No grand declarations, no sparks flying visibly through the air, and yet something undeniable shifted. The line between loyalty and desire is thinner than most people want to believe, and that night it blurred so delicately that I almost didn't feel it at first. But now, looking back, I know the exact moment it gave way. Subtle as breath, weightless as a glance, and I stepped over without even meaning to, or maybe deep down I did mean to. Maybe it was a choice wrapped in denial, justified by silence and the desperate need to feel something real again. The meeting had run long, everyone else had left. It was just the two of us, packing up papers, exchanging quiet comments about the day. The room felt heavy with unspoken things. There had always been a hum in the background whenever we were near each other, but that night it was louder, buzzing just beneath our words. I felt it in the way our hands brushed briefly across the table. Nothing prolonged, nothing overt, but enough to freeze time for a second. I didn't flinch. He didn't pull back too quickly. We both let it happen. It was raining when we stepped outside, soft but persistent, like the world was trying to whisper a warning. I hadn't driven, and before I could even ask for a ride, he offered. The words were simple, said with a polite tone, but the air between us held 1,000 implications. I nodded. My voice was gone. I didn't say yes. I just moved toward his car as if pulled by gravity. As soon as the door clicked shut beside me, I felt it. The silence, the nearness, the intimacy of shared space that felt far more private than it should have. The drive wasn't long, but every second of it stretched out like it was happening in slow motion. We didn't talk much. It wasn't awkward, it was charged. My hands were folded tightly in my lap. His eyes flicked toward me at every stoplight. There was no touching, no words that could be considered crossing a line. And still, everything about it was crossing a line. The kind of line that lives in your mind, that your heart knows better than your logic ever could. I was completely aware of what I was doing, even as I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. We reached my street, and still he didn't drop his gaze. He didn't speed off with a quick goodbye. He parked the car and just waited. It was quiet except for the rain tapping on the windshield. The silence was no longer empty, it was full. Full of possibility, of restraint, of decisions hanging between us. I felt his eyes on me again, not demanding, but open, and I turned my face toward him, barely. It wasn't a move of seduction. It was involuntary, like my body responding to something it had longed for without permission. We didn't kiss, there was no embrace, but the moment was more intimate than if we had, because there, in that still, silent space, was a shared hunger neither of us admitted aloud. My heart was racing, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of being wanted, from the awareness that this was something sacred and dangerous at the same time. The way he looked at me, God, that look it reached past everything I had tried to bury. I was no longer just a woman in a car. I was a woman being seen, fully and silently invited into a moment I could never take back. I got out of the car. My legs felt weak, like I had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the fall. He didn't follow. He stayed in the car, engine idling, eyes still on me as I walked to the door. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I felt his gaze burning between my shoulder blades, branding something invisible onto my skin. Something permanent, something that wasn't supposed to happen but did, because even without a touch, we had both reached across the line. Inside my house, the lights were on. My husband was there. The familiarity should have grounded me, but it only deepened the ache in my chest. Because I knew I had just lived a moment that didn't belong in my marriage, a moment that rewrote everything I thought I could justify. I hadn't cheated, not in the literal sense, but emotionally, spiritually. I had stepped into forbidden territory with open eyes and trembling breath. What made it worse wasn't the act. It was the craving, the desire for more, the echo of that almost touch, that unsaid thing, that magnetic pull still alive in my bones. I couldn't confess it, but I also couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. It sat between my ribs like a secret altar, glowing in the dark. I told myself it was nothing, that it could be forgotten. But you don't forget when someone sees you in a way you've been dying to be seen. You don't forget a night when no one touched you, but you still came undone. In the days that followed, everything outside me moved as if nothing had changed. But inside, I was unraveling. The encounter had cracked something open that I could no longer close, no matter how desperately I tried. There were no explicit betrayals to confess, no act that could be labeled with certainty, but the guilt that settled over me was heavy and undeniable. It followed me from room to room like a shadow, whispering truths I wasn't ready to face. The moment in that car had awakened a part of me I had long buried, a part that wanted, needed, craved something more than the numbness I had accepted as normal. I couldn't look at my husband the same way. His face, so familiar, felt distant now, not because he had changed, but because I had. Every glance from him felt like a test. Every touch, however innocent, made me flinch, not out of disgust or anger, but because I felt unworthy of it. I had let someone else into a space I had once promised only to him, not with my body, but with something just as sacred, my thoughts, my desire, my vulnerability. I tried to silence it, tried to carry on with the same routines, but the internal conflict was deafening. I found myself hyper-aware of everything. My phone, my expressions, the time I spent lost in thought. I would replay that car ride over and over in my head, not to romanticize it, but to punish myself. To dissect every second and convince myself that it was innocent. But the more I did, the more I realized that innocence had left the room long before the night ended. It wasn't what had happened, but what had been felt, that left the deepest bruise. Emotional intimacy, when directed towards someone who isn't your partner, is a betrayal of a different breed. It doesn't leave lipstick stains or perfume on collars, but it stains the soul in ways that don't easily wash off. I wanted to talk to someone, anyone, but how do you explain a betrayal that never crossed the line physically, yet somehow felt just as real? How do you say I didn't cheat, but I still feel like I did? The shame was isolating. I felt like I was carrying a secret I couldn't share, a truth that would destroy everything if spoken aloud. I became quieter at home, more withdrawn. My laughter didn't come as easily. I started avoiding his eyes, fearing he might see something in them that I didn't want him to find. I wasn't sure if I was protecting him or protecting myself. What made the guilt worse was that a small, shameful part of me didn't regret how I had felt. That part still remembered the thrill of being noticed, the softness of that unspoken connection, and I hated that. I hated that I missed something I never even had. I was caught in a loop of self-loathing, angry at my husband for not seeing me sooner, angry at myself for stepping outside the emotional lines we had drawn together, and terrified of what it all meant. Did it mean I no longer loved him? Did it mean we were already broken? I began to scrutinize every corner of our marriage through this new lens. The absence of affection, the dwindling communication, the mechanical way we moved around each other. And for a while, I tried to convince myself that those cracks justified what I had allowed to happen, that I had only responded to a need my partner had long stopped trying to fulfill, but deep down, I knew better. Loneliness is not an excuse. Neglect doesn't grant permission. I had choices and I had made them, quietly, willfully, and now I had to live with the knowledge that even the smallest betrayal can leave the deepest wound. The emotional aftermath didn't come with confrontation or discovery. It came with silence, the kind of silence that eats away at you from the inside out. I would lie awake at night, listening to his breathing, wondering if he sensed the shift in me. wondering if my guilt was transparent. I wanted him to ask me, to look me in the eyes and say what happened to us, but he didn't. He couldn't see it, or maybe he chose not to, and so I lived in the in-between, a space haunted by what could have been and what already was. A space where my marriage still stood, technically intact, but emotionally splintered. I began to question everything, the vows we had made, the years we had shared, the quiet erosion we had both allowed. I asked myself if love could survive betrayal of the heart, even when the body remained faithful. I didn't have the answers. All I had was the guilt, raw, suffocating, and entirely mine.